Hello, everybody. Welcome. Good to see you. Mute some mics there. Look like we had some interference there. Welcome. Thanks for joining. Really thrilled to have you all here. Still got some people arriving, but we'll let them in as we go. So a few things before we start on today's event. Firstly, if my internet or Anthony's internet drops out as we go through, stick around. We'll be back momentarily. Just make just so you know, these things occasionally happen, right? Once every blue moon. So if that happens today, apologies, but stick around and we'll get back as soon as we can. Do please make sure your Zoom name's correct. So the first and the last name you'd have registered for today's session with. That will ensure that we know who turned up and who didn't, and we can make sure that we contact those that didn't turn up and get them on another session in the future. So if you don't want to avoid that contact from my team saying you didn't turn up, that would be great if you could make sure you have your name correct. So your first and your last name that you registered for today with, not your brand name, nothing like that. So you can just re-click. Sort of click your black and white kind of name badge there on Zoom and you should get a rename option. So if you could do that, that would be awesome. Finally, as many videos on as possible, that would be great, so we can see your faces. And I'm going to put your microphones on mute just to cut out any background noise. Obviously, we're going to try and have time, make sure we have time for a Q&A at the very end. So the last sort of 10-15 minutes, we'll look to have a Q&A. Hopefully we'll have time for that, and so if we can keep some questions for the end as you go through, take some notes, jot down any questions you have as we go, and we'll answer those all in one go at the end between me and Anthony. And I think that's pretty much it for the house rules of today. So a quick introduction to me and Robot Mascot first, for those of you who don't know who we are. I'm James Church. I'm the author of the best-selling book, Investable Entrepreneur. I'm also the co-founder at Robot Mascot. Robot Mascot's basically an investment readiness agency. We specialize in creating investment materials that convince investors. We do this with sort of pre-seed, seed, Series A funding rounds. I've personally supported over 3,000 founders to date, worked with entrepreneurs from all over the world to raise investment in the UK, Europe, Middle East, USA, Asia, Africa, Australia, literally clients from all over the world. And when they implement the strategies that we've employed here at Robot Mascot, they're 40 times more likely to raise investment, and they've raised more than 220 million to date. We've won some major awards as well along the way. We've got Disruptor Company of the Year at the Global Globee Awards, Business Advisor of the Year at the UK's Growing Business Awards as well. And really, what we just want to see is great ideas and innovation flourish. We want to see these great ideas get off the ground, raise the investment they need. And we get really frustrated at seeing so many founders fail to do that because of poor communication. So look, I just want to say a massive thank you to every single one of you in today's session on behalf of not only Robot Mascot, but mainly on behalf of Abuya here and many other African women just like her. We believe in the power of entrepreneurship to change the world, but also to change lives, right, at a more individual level. And the ticket for goods that you purchased to be here today and listen to me and Anthony mean that we've collectively been able to provide 23 years worth of business training to women in Africa to get a business off of the ground, to pull themselves and their families out of poverty. So that's 23 women in Africa who are going to be receiving a year's worth of business training and support as a result of the tickets we sold for today's event. So that's absolutely outstanding work to every single one of you. Thank you so much for being part of that. And I'm super proud that we've been able to put this event on with SeedLegals, for SeedLegals giving up their time today, and Anthony sparing that time to support us in supporting you, and at the same time supporting these entrepreneurs from less privileged backgrounds as well. So massive thank you to everyone for being here. So before I invite our special guest, Anthony, onto the stage, I just want to point you in the direction of my free 90-minute fundraising strategy session. If you're currently raising investment, if you're planning on raising investment, if you're just trying to figure out whether raising investment's right for you, this session is going to unpack our winning strategy that leads to that success we talked about just a few slides ago. We delve inside of the mind of the investor. We'll unpack all the critical fundraising assets and tools you're going to need to convince investors your business is the one to back. And we're going to cover an investor outreach strategy that will stimulate demand and have investors lining up. So It's recently been described as the best 90 minutes someone's ever invested in their business, which is pretty cool. And it's a completely free session, but there are limited spaces, so you need to get in quick. And I'm just about to share the link in the chat so you can book that as well. So there you go. There is the link. You can book a free session if you haven't already been on one of those. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Anthony Rose of SeedLegals to the stage. SeedLegals have been a partner now of ours for must be well over 6 years. They're absolutely fantastic. I highly rate them. I've never heard anyone say a bad word about their service. Anthony himself, he's an absolute legend. He's like the brains behind BBC iPlayer. He's been a founder and investor in numerous ventures. He's now the figurehead of SeedLegals, and you've got to listen really carefully to this guy today, because he oozes knowledge. He drops continual nuggets when he presents. So get those notepads out and make sure you take down every word that he says. And the reason I wanted to invite Anthony to do this event with us today is because I get asked time and again kind of questions about the legal process that comes with raising investment, and very few founders have properly considered kind of what happens during the later stages of the fundraising process. Founders will kind of plow full steam ahead into creating their pitch and kind of getting all of those kind of sexy documents ready without kind of considering what comes next. When you actually have that investor wanting to invest in your business, what do you do? Like, you know, and what's even more surprising for many founders are all the legal documents they need in place before they even start their round, when they're reaching out to investors. You know, all of these things come up in due diligence, the process that happens after the pitch, and they're required for an investor before they're even willing to commit to their investment. So over the next 60 minutes or so, Anthony's going to explain to you what legals you're going to need in place prior to your raise, what legals you're going to need in place to actually close your round once you've got an investor on board, the typical legal process, what that looks like from kind of term sheet to getting the investors in the bank. And it'll also touch on alternative approaches to closing your round as well. So Anthony, over to you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I think I've managed to draw on my screen somehow as well, looking at that. I don't know how I managed that one, but there we go. Over to you for the next 60 minutes or so. Everyone, as I say, listen to Anthony closely. He's going to drop so many nuggets for you today.
All right. Well, thank you, James, and thanks for the extremely kind intro. So hello, I'm Anthony. I'm founder and CEO at SeedLegals. We're now about 150 people at SeedLegals. About 1 in 3 of all first funding rounds in the UK is on SeedLegals. HMRC have just published their latest stats on the number of SEIS and EIS advance assurances done in the world. And I'm delighted to say we do 51% of all SEIS advance assurances. I've been joking, if it gets to more than 50%, we should just call the government and say you can save a ton of money and just just use our platform. But I talk to many, many founders, and I see many, many companies using SeedLegals. And today I'm here not to pitch SeedLegals, but to share knowledge to help you. So as James mentioned, I used to head up BBC iPlayer. After I left the BBC, I built a startup, sold it, built another one, sold it, invested in a few, got tired of paying lawyers, met my co-founder, genius ex-VC and serial angel investor, and decided to change that so that essentially to productize and automate all the legals around building your company fundraising. And what I learned along the way is you might think that you're looking for legals, but actually what it turns out what people really are looking for is exactly the brain dump I'm going to try on this call, which is what is the founder journey? What are the mistakes people made? What should you do? What are market standard deal terms? When should you invest? Who should you talk to raise? And by the way, here are all the legals for your round, but that's kind of like the boring bit. So the legals is the topic, I guess, but we're going to the legals is the solution to the problem, not anything to excite. Now, before I jump in, quick show of hands, who here has not done their first fundraise yet? And I can see some fraction of folks, so most people have not yet raised. Okay, who's raised 1 round so far? All right, so then I think I've got the exact things that I hope you're after. So I'm going to screen share periodically as like the segue between, and then turn off screen share so that oh, I need to be enabled for screen sharing, James. All right, maybe James has gone for a cup of tea.
There you go.
Oh, no,
you're good.
I can screen share. All right, so I've loosely called this the 10 most important things for your next funding round. And we'll do a quick, view of a slide and then turn it off so we can see more arm waving. So the very first thing are founder agreements. So you're out, you have an idea, you're out for a run, you're in the shower, wherever you have an idea, it's probably you having the idea, and you go, great, I think this idea's got legs and I want to go and start a company. So the good news is in the UK, you can incorporate in about 30 minutes on Companies House, costs you £12. It's insanely easy compared to anywhere else in the world. And then you will, when you incorporate, you'll typically create 100 ordinary shares, which will be distributed amongst the founders. So my data at SeedLegals shows that companies can have any number of founders, but most have got 2 founders, and companies with 2 founders raise maybe slightly faster and maybe raise slightly more than companies with solo founders or with 3 or more founders. If they're more than 3 founders, things inevitably go wrong and they're just too many founders. People have got too little equity each. So a few takeaway points from that. Number one, when you incorporate your company, sometimes I hear, my accountant told me I should create what's called alphabet shares, A shares and B shares and C. Don't do that. Literally 100% of the time I've seen people create these A and B and C shares. They have to undo it when they want to raise investment, because investors hate it. And I think what happens is you think, Zuckerberg, he's got these special super voting shares, he controls Facebook, I want the same, otherwise investors will, fire me. And it turns out that, of course, if you build Facebook, you can then do what you want later. But your goal is to remove the friction from investors investing in your company. So they see, an investor would see many companies, and if all of them have got ordinary shares split between the founders, and then one of them's got like special super vote, they just go, dude, that's too complicated, undo it and call us back later. So my strong advice is just start with ordinary shares split between the founders. So now you've incorporated your business, which you can do really easily. And by the way, if you've got any questions, please pop them in the chat. I may glance at the chat periodically, but I'll certainly get to them at the end, if not beforehand. But please, I love this to be interactive. Pop in with chats and maybe raise your hand if you can. And if I spot it, I'll turn to you. So what usually then happens is you incorporate your business, a couple of founders, 50 shares each, and you're good. But there's a problem. What happens if you split up, if things don't go well? And anecdotally, I'd say on SeedLegals, maybe 10% of the time, maybe more during COVID, founders split up. Takes longer to fundraise. Somebody needs to pay the mortgage or the rent, and they need a steady job, or someone hasn't given up their job to devote their time to it, or it's taking longer to build it, and the salesperson is getting bored, they've got nothing to do, and the tech person is going, I'm spending insane amounts of time. So a fair fraction of the time, things don't work out. And what you want to guard against that, things going wrong, is a founder agreement. So what is a founder agreement? A founder agreement is an agreement between each of the founders individually and the company, which is why you do it after you've incorporated, saying broadly 3 or 4 key things. Number one, founder vesting. Technically, it's called reverse vesting. So it says, I've got 50 shares, and if I leave anytime in the next 3 years, I have to give some of them back again. So after 3 years, I own them all. If I leave after a year, I have to return 2/3 of them. So this so-called reverse vesting is what saves the day when things go wrong. And it may turn out a year into the relationship, things aren't working out and somebody wants to leave. And so if you don't have a founder agreement, what's been an easy allocation of shares at the pub over a beer, like, yeah, you 50, I'll take 50. And then later on, you've now raised your first round, or you're going to the business, you've put a valuation of 2 million on it. And suddenly somebody goes, my shares are worth $1 million. I'd like you to buy my shares from me for $1 million. It doesn't work because you don't have the $1 million to buy them, and it's only a notional value. So if you don't have a founder agreement with vesting, and firstly, investors will force you to do one before they invest. And secondly, doing a founder agreement is really good doing early on, because it forces you to define the roles. Sometimes there are these difficult conversations like who's CEO and who's CTO, and what is the exact percent equity that we get. And the earlier you have that conversation, the better it is, because it's you always want to defer difficult conversations. But if you have it just after meeting in the pub and you agree, that's great. And if you don't agree, you just walk away. But if you spent a year of your life on it and can't agree after that, it's a serious problem. So the vesting is the key thing in the founder agreement. The next thing is you don't want your co-founder leaving and going, I'm going to nick the team, take the source code, and go and build my own competitor because I don't like what you're doing. So the other thing a founder agreement has is an IP assignment saying all the intellectual property, the ideas, designs, code is now owned by the company, including the thing we developed together before the company started. And an IP assignment is super important to have, because when it comes time for investment, maybe not your first friends and family investors because they wouldn't know or care, but when you have later on a VC, they're going to see and want to see as part of the due diligence that the company owns all of its intellectual property. And if you haven't got employment agreements or consulting agreements or founder agreements, and people have just worked on something with no agreement, then it becomes particularly problematic, particularly if they haven't been paid, where they might claim they now own the IP. And so you might be now trying to trace the designer or the first developer who's disappeared and is trekking in the Amazon forest or something, and now goes, oh, wait, the company's got a value of $1 million. Great, I'd like 50K for my IP, please. So always create those agreements as soon. Never let anyone do any work on the product until you've created a suitable founder, employment, consulting, advisor agreement. And the good news is they're all essentially free on SeedLegals. It used to be the case that it was super hard to do, but now there's like no excuse to not do them because it's super easy. The other thing a founder agreement has is a non-compete and a non-solicitation. So if things don't work out, they can't just start a competing company. So philosophically, what I am quite intrigued about is the concept of creating a company says that we're essentially taking our individual ownerships and things and putting it into something that will be the greater good. And we can come and go, but the company is going to continue. Now, just one thing on the vesting, which is vesting is a kind of a double-edged sword, because if your co-founder, has a fight with you and leaves, you're going to go going, bastard, they shouldn't keep any of the equity. But if you leave, you want, maybe you spent a year of your life on the company, you still want to keep some of your equity. You've had lower than market salary. The equity is why you did this. So when you create vesting, either for employees or for founders, you can choose different patterns. And one pattern is what's called 3-year straight line vesting, which says I start with zero. If I leave on day one, I have to return 100%, so I own 0. And after 3 years, I own it all. And if I leave, I don't return anything. Another pattern is so-called 4-year vesting with a 1-year cliff. And this means if I leave in the first year, I lose everything. And at the end of the first year, I immediately jump to 25% and then keep going from there. And often investors, particularly accelerators and super early stage investors, will ask that you have vesting that's 4 years with a 1-year cliff. Now, for you as a founder, that's quite troubling, because the idea is if somebody isn't with the company and maybe hangs around for a few months, you don't want them having shares. It just didn't work out. So the cliff period is great for saying either it works and you're going to get equity, or it doesn't and you get nothing. But the challenge is you might have actually spent 9 months on the project. You couldn't get on with the others, and you leave and you now get nothing. So I think the cliff works if you're getting paid a salary, because that's your compensation is the salary, and the shares are kind of the nice to have on top of that. But if you're not earning any salary, then you still want to get some shares. Anyway, so that's going to be an interesting thing. And the last thing before I leave vesting is that if you haven't set up a founder agreement with vesting, when it comes to your first funding round, at least with astute investors, they'll force you to do that. And they'll generally ask that vesting starts from that funding round. But if you set it up at the beginning, you can have already a good fraction of your shares vested by the time you get to a funding round, and argue, usually and hopefully successfully, you won't always win the battle, that, hey, I've already set up vesting a while back, half of it's already vested, I'm not starting the clock again. So that's a top tip on vesting. So now, next question. Thanks for the question from Sean about, are they equal founders? So one of the most difficult problems to solve, it's not a legal one, it's a social engineering one, is should you be 50-50, or what percent equity should you have? And it's the fantastically interesting one, because I totally don't know the answer. But often where it gets difficult is sometimes two founders get together and they both see they're going to bring equal time and equal value to the company. And then if you do 50-50 or something around that, that's going to make sense. But what if you started the business on your own? It was your idea, and then somebody comes to join 6 months later. Should they get 3% equity, 10%, 50%? How are you going to work it out? And here's my top tip. It doesn't mean it's definitively right, but I think what I've seen, people make short-term views on what the equity split should be rather than a long-term view. So let's say you've been working on this for 6 months, and you desperately need a CTO, and you find a CTO who now joins and they want some equity. So your starting point might be, well, dude, it was my idea. I've been doing this for 6 months. I'm going to give you 10% equity. And that might be the right answer, but it might be the wrong answer. The CTO might be, well, no, that's not going to work. I'm equal partners. So what I like to do, and I think I propose this as a mental exercise, is if you pretend it's now 4 years from now, so it's 2027, your company is 100 people, you're doing a couple of £1 million a year in sales and revenue. You've been working on this insanely hard for the last 4 years, as has your co-founder, or not. So if you skip ahead to 4 years from now, what would be the relative equity position at that point? And you'll probably find that actually the starting position, the fact that you spend 6 months on it, it was your idea, actually doesn't carry that much weight. It's what you're doing and running a 100-person company and generating sales, and the time you're both putting in, and your connections and so on, that's much more important. So jumping forward is a great technique to help you work out for yourself, and also to justify to your co-founder what it might be on and why they are getting as many or few shares as you have in mind. So we're now going to switch from founders to employees. So you've incorporated your company, you've got some founder agreements, you've sorted the IP, and you now want to hire some employees. But there's a problem. You don't have any money. So, of course, you might be funding it yourself. Our SeedLegals data shows founders put in a median of £26,000 of their own money into the business, because nobody's going to invest just on a PowerPoint. Ideas are cheap. So you need to do an MVP or a mock-up or a prototype. You're going to be paying to make a great pitch deck, of course, as well. So what you're going to be doing is probably funding it as far as you can yourself. And now you want to have people join. But if you can't afford to pay them market salary, can you give them shares or share options in lieu of that? So I'm going to jump to the answer on what to do. And you might give somebody shares, as in on Companies House, they've got shares, or you might give them share options, which is a right to a share. And if they're an employee, you'll create something called an EMI option scheme, which is the most tax efficient way of giving somebody shares in the future. So if you give someone share options, you'll create an option pool. I may explain that in a few minutes. then, and you typically do that at the time of your first funding round, then you create an option scheme, and then you agree a company valuation with HMRC, so that the employee gets the maximum tax benefits and pays as little as possible for the shares and gets the biggest upside. So when would you give somebody shares and when would you give somebody share options? And the answer is, if there's an employee in particular of the company and you give them shares, let's say you've raised your first round and Alice joins the company and you go, Alice, I'm giving you 1% equity in shares, and the company valuation's, let's say, 2 million. So 1% is £20,000 of shares. If you give Alice £20,000 worth of shares, that will mean that Alice now incurs a tax liability as if she'd been paid an extra 20,000, and the company will have to pay PAYE and national insurance as if they'd paid the person £20,000. And it's a bit of a disaster. So the rule of thumb is, if the shares still have no value, which is typically before your first round, then you can give people shares, which is why the founders start with all of the shares when you incorporate. And if you have a CTO joining you some months later, sure, give them shares. But once the company, the shares have a value, which is definitely after your first funding round, and in the few months potentially leading to your first funding round, you want to avoid giving, particularly to employees, when it becomes an employment-related security taxable issue, you want to give them share options instead of shares. So there's really, I've just solved you a lot of trouble for you, which is at the beginning, when the shares have got no value, feel free to give people shares. And when the shares have a value, for employees, you're going to give them what's called EMI options. You create a share scheme, do an EMI valuation and give them EMI options, and they pay only 10% capital gains tax when they sell the shares. The company doesn't pay any tax. It's a great deal from the UK government, and it's one of few countries that has got such a good system. If the person's not an employee, like they're an advisor or a consultant, then they can't get these tax advantaged options. You'd give them something called unapproved options. It doesn't mean they're illegal. It just means you haven't agreed a valuation and it's not approved by HMRC. So the person, when they exercise their options, they'll pay tax, income tax or capital gains tax, as if you'd given them some value, but that only happens later when they exercise the options. And there are a lot of resources on the SeedLegals website, or if you need more, you can just hit me up on LinkedIn and I will tell you more about shares or options. Now, there's one more thing on that while we're discussing it, which is how many shares or options should I give you? And this is a big problem. So let's say you want an advisor. You think your slide deck will look better if you've got some advisors on it. I have to say, I'm not a huge fan of advisors. I've been a fabulously well-paid advisor in the past, and you arrive, for your monthly board meeting or whatever, and they say, oh, wise one, what should we do? And you rattle off something about, yes, your business should be subscription, and you do this, and then you disappear again. I much prefer that you rather give your money or your shares to people who 24/7 part of your team, rather than someone who'll breeze in, because I've discovered that all the things that are problematic in the company are not things that have easy answers where you just go, yeah, create a recurring billing model. It turns out your customers don't want a recurring billing model. They want to buy one off, or just launch in this country. Well, actually, it's not that easy. So for me, I'm not a huge fan of advisors and giving equity to advisors, but maybe that's just because I've been around for longer, and in your space it's different, or maybe you're in the medical thing and having some famous person on the slide deck is important. But whichever way, if you are looking to give somebody shares or share options, the question is how much to give them. So let's say you've got your advisor, a board advisor, that's going to come along monthly for board meetings, and they've agreed to spend a day a month with you, helping you, and they want like 3% equity. So on its face, is 3% insanely low, or is it insanely high? How do you even decide? So here's my top tip, which is, pick a valuation of the company and work out the value of that equity in pounds. So let's say that the company valuation was, let's say, 3 million. So 3% is going to be £90,000. So if your advisor says, I'd like 3% equity, then it's like saying, I'm giving you £90,000. So for £90,000, you're going to breeze in for a day a week, a day a month. You've got to be kidding. So I might think that, let's say over a year, £10,000 is reasonable, maybe 20K at maximum. So 20K would be for 1 year. And let's say I'd like to have you as an advisor, I think up front for 2 years. So that's £40,000. So £40,000, my 3 million valuation is like 1.3% or something like that. So what I'll do is I'll give you 1.3% equity vesting over 2 years. And it's the vesting which is important, because in the same way, you don't pay your iOS developer like the entire annual salary on January the 1st. Likewise, you should just never give someone equity without vesting. So what you're going to do is you're going to go on SeedLegals and you create an advisor agreement, and you're going to say, you're going to provide these services and advice in this amount of time, and getting it in writing is super important, because otherwise, how do you terminate if the person doesn't perform? How do they know what they want to do? So a good legal agreement is, to me, important, not just for all the legal boilerplate stuff, but it actually, because it forces you to define what both parties want. So you're going to create an advisor agreement saying you're going to come, you're going to give us a day a month, we're going to ask you advice on these things, you're going to respond in a timely fashion, we can terminate either way on 30 days notice, and you're going to get 1.3% equity, vesting over 2 years. And then if it doesn't work out after 6 months, you just terminate and they keep a quarter of that. And that's great. Essentially, that's their payment for services. You have worked out a sensible amount. So anyway, that was all about equity for team and advisors. So let me have a quick look at some questions. So Mustafa says, I started my company with 1 share for £1, and I'm going to split the shares, and someone's looking to invest and needs a contract. Okay, so when you incorporate your company on Companies House, you'll often start with like 1 share at £1 or 100 shares at £1. Very occasionally, somebody makes a terrible mistake and says, if I only make 100 shares for £1, the company's only worth £100. What I need to do is make 1 million shares for £1, and then it's worth £1 million. Don't do this, because when you incorporate your company, it's always worth precisely 0 at the beginning. And if you make 1 million shares at £1 each, all it means is, as the founder, you literally have to write a check to the company for the £1 million to pay for your shares. Otherwise, you've got shares that you haven't paid for, and one day an investor will say you haven't owned them. So don't try and make the company have a value from the shares that you created. The value comes later from the pitch and the pitch deck and agreeing a valuation and a funding round. So the normal formula is you'll create like 100 shares on Company House for £1 each. You'd have to pay £50 each to the company to buy your shares and pay for them. And then you'll want to do a share split. So when you do your funding round, let's say your funding round valuation is £2 million, and you've got 100 shares. That would mean each share is worth £20,000, which means investors can only invest a multiple of £20,000 because you can't have fractional shares. So somebody who says, hey, I'd like to invest 5K, you say, sorry, it's 0 or 20K. That's not so useful. So what you do is a share split so that you make, let's say, 1 million shares, and then the price per share is £2, and people can invest any amount rounded to the nearest £2. So per Mustafa's question, a share split, you'll make typically 1 million shares. You can do the share split on SeedLegals. It's super easy, or get your accountant, whoever, to do it. And that is the step 2 after incorporation, when you're ready to split the shares. And then step 3 is the funding round to create the investment agreements for your investor. And we'll get to that in a few moments. So question from Sean about you're going to create a bank account, which ironically turns out to be one of the most difficult founder problems that you find, because banks turn out to be notoriously difficult. I think on Tide, they said, sorry, Index Ventures is an investor and they've invested via a Jersey company, so you can't have an account with us. Okay, great. That's going to rule out lots of startups. But you'll create a bank account, and at some point you'll pay for your shares. You can pay for things individually and charge it to the company later once the company's set up. I think you can go back up to a year for expenses that you've incurred personally and put them into the company. But I think the time to create a company is the point where you start wanting to make legal agreements with people. Maybe you want to get a VAT number so you can start claiming VAT back later. But certainly at the point you want to have employment, other contracts, these are all with the company, or you want to start selling things and of course billing through the company and invoicing. So the so quick question from Ian, which is, what is the minimum acceptable time to issue shares to directors before raising your first round? This is a great question. So if when you start your company the shares are worth 0 and you can happily give people shares, and then at the closing of your first funding round, the company valuation is clearly whatever it was in the funding round, let's say £2 million. At what point did it go from 0 to 2 million? And I don't know the answer. But the short answer is the closer you leave it, the more difficult it will become to argue that the valuation was still 0. So if it's 3 months before the funding round and you haven't sent out a term sheet and it's a twinkle in your eye and you've got no revenue, it's pretty clear it's still 0. But if you've sent out a term sheet and you've got investor interest and you're discussing valuations, even though you haven't issued new shares, you may have a hard time if HMRC queries the valuation and points to, a listing page or something that shows you've been, saying its value is 2 million. So you might find that maybe the point is, once you start sending out a term sheet, at that point, it's going to be more difficult to argue that the company valuation is still 0 because it's about to be something more. It might be something to discuss with your accountant, and I don't claim to know the answer on that. All right. So I'm now going to switch to the next topic, which is going to be SEIS. So let me go to my screen share here. So I'm guessing that pretty much everyone knows about SEIS, but just in case not, I'll cover it very quickly, particularly since it just got better. So in the UK, there's a fantastic scheme where investors get to claim back some of their money from their income tax if they invest in your company. So you used to be able to raise £150,000 in SEIS, and your investors could claim 50% tax off, or 50% of the investment amount off their tax. That has now changed to you can raise £250,000, which is great. And then you can raise like £12 million in EIS, and the investor can deduct 30%. But either way, after they've deducted from their income tax, if they keep their shares for 3 years and sell it after that, they pay no capital gains tax. And if your company goes bankrupt, they can even write off the losses on their investment. So it's a great system, and it applies to any angel investor that's a UK taxpayer. So that's anyone investing personally. And as a result, my data shows that UK startup fundraising is completely fueled by angel investors investing with these tax benefits for them. So if any rounds under raising about £500,000, I'd say 80% of all the investment is either angel investors directly or SEIS, EIS funds that will collect angel investors and invest, and they'll all be looking for their tax benefits. Now, HMRC's got a system where you can write to them up front to get a letter of comfort for investors, advance assurance. It's not legally required. In fact, once upon a time, there was no such comfort letter. And then investors would go, how do I know that I can get my SEIS? And companies would go, Well, I hope you can. Let me see if I can get some comfort from HMRC that I can tell you can. So a few companies started applying for advance assurance, and now it's basically the pendulum swung all the other way, which is investors kind of say, have you got your advance assurance? It's not legally required, but it's usually the difference between I'm in versus call me when you've got your advance assurance, come back later. So you can apply on the HMRC website. There are quite a few gotchas. There's the risk to capital and a few things that can make you not qualify. You also need to provide the name, address, and intended investment amount. Doesn't need to be committed, but intended for at least 25% of the amount of advance assurance you want to apply for. So if you want to be able to say to your investors, I've got advance assurance for £300,000, you probably need to show evidence of at least £80,000 of intended investment. So we've streamlined all of that process on SeedLegals. As I said, 51% of all of them are done on SeedLegals. I'm not here to pitch that that's the way to do it, but actually it's just much easier. And having this advance assurance letter is, again, not required, but often the difference between I'm in, first come back later. So quick question, which is your company qualifies for EIS, says Tony, but not SEIS due to the company age. So that's a great point. So when you incorporate your company, there's no clock starts ticking, but once you start making your first trade, your first commercial trade, typically when you've sold something, at that point, that's called the start of trade. And you used to have 2 years. Now it's increased to 3 years from your first trade to issuing shares for you to be able to offer SEIS to those investors. So less than 3 years from first trade. But after that, you can no longer offer the 50% SEIS benefits, and your company can be up to 7 years trading, and you can offer the EIS benefits, which are less good. And by the way, there's a trick as well, which is if you've ever raised EIS in the first 7 years, you now are expanding new products or new markets, you can continue to raise EIS even after that. I'm guessing for most people on the call, this is a nice thing to know for 7 years' time. But so the point, Tony, is if you have exhausted your SEIS or you pass the limit for it, it's not the end of the world. I mean, companies do raise money, but you may have a harder time persuading your early investors who might be looking at lots of companies going SEIS, EIS, SEIS, and you have a less good offer. So they're still going to get the tax benefits, the no capital gains tax on, and the loss relief, but they won't be getting as good a discount from their income tax. And of course, you are going to have your work cut out to show them that it's not just the tax benefits, it's the growing company. It's going to be a fantastic business. It's already been trading. You've got less risk. We've already validated the concept. So you're going to pick anything in your playbook to show why it's going to be a terrific deal. All right, and then question from Ian, how quickly can investors claim back the 50% tax relief? Is it within 12 months or longer? Great question, because your investors are going to ask you exactly that. Hey, when can I get my cash thing? So the way it works is investors give you money. Sometimes you're going to use a SeedFast and you'll issue shares later, which we'll get to, or it's in a funding round and they get their shares. Once they've got their shares, you can now do what's called SEIS or EIS compliance, where HMRC, you write to them and you get a certificate back that you give to your investor that they can use for their income tax deduction. And when they do their next income tax filing, they pass this information on to their accountant, and they can now deduct half of that from their payable income tax. And they can do that in this tax year, or, and not many people know this, they can backdate to the previous tax year as well. So let's say you're closing your funding round in September, the investor will probably get their SEIS certificate in October, and they can then claim it when they do their next tax return in this year, or they can say, actually, I'm going to backdate it to claim it had I done this last tax year? And then the HMRC will send them a check or carry the loss forward or whatever it might be. So that's everything to do with SEIS and EIS. Okay, so next, we're moving from people to fundraising. So now comes, I want to start raising investment. And of course, you're going to talk to the nice folks at Robot Mascot to create a great pitch deck. And your question is, how much should I raise? And what's my company valuation? So let's start with the valuation, because the valuation is kind of weird, right? Because you've spent a few weekends on this, okay, maybe a bit longer, and you've invested £20,000 of your own money, and now you're telling an investor it's worth £2 million, and they're going, how did that happen? So you've got two problems to solve. One, pick a value for your company, and number two, justify it to your investor. Because if you can't justify it, then it's just a made up number. They're going to make up a different number. So how are you going to do it? Well, I joke that firstly, you can go to TechCrunch and look at the figures there and then take at least 1 0 off, because those are insane US valuations, and they just quote the bigger stories. The next one is you can try and look at other companies like yours that have raised, but that's a bit harder because people will often say, I raised this amount, but you won't often see the valuation they raised at. The third one is you can go to your accountant and say, can you value my company? And your accountant will go, great. Are you profitable? You go, no. Have you got revenue? You go, no. Are you losing money? Oh, yes. So they're going to say, well, remind me why your valuation is greater than 0 and why you are going concern at all. So your accountant is useless to value the company. Why? Because accountants value the company on past revenue, and investors are valuing the company based on future potential. So it's all about the future potential. So how are you going to value the company? Well, one of the things that I've seen at SeedLegals is that funding rounds follow a particular form. And the form is that in a funding round, you will typically sell 15% equity. So you dilute by 15% in a funding round. So that's the peak of the curve over here. So if an investor is saying, I'd like 30% of the equity for, my £200,000 or something, you'd be an outlier here. So you really want to aim to fundraise and dilute not substantially more than 15% in a funding round. So where does this magic 15% figure come from? Well, by the way, in later stage rounds, it might be a little higher. You may find in early ones it's a bit smaller. But I think the magic 15% goes as follows, which is your goal as a founder might be to raise 3 rounds of funding. Each time you're raising 3 to 5 times the last round at 3 to 5 times the valuation, such that after 3 funding rounds, either you don't need to raise again, or you're ready to sell the business at a decent valuation, and everyone has a benefit from the return on their time or investment for investors. So if you're diluting 3 times, each time diluting 15%, and you create a 10% share option pool, then after 3 funding rounds, the founders will have 56% equity, which is above 50, which is good. So the founders are still the majority shareholders after 3 funding rounds if you're diluting at 15% per time. But if you're diluting at 25% per time, then after 2 rounds or after 3 rounds, the founders will start becoming minority shareholders, which puts you more at the mercy of shareholders. They have more votes than you. And also that personally, if you're 3 founders and the founders collectively have 30% equity, you've got 10% equity, the skin in the game starts becoming less interesting. So if you can raise at a smaller dilution, that is the go. So what I've seen is, when people show me a slide deck and I'm thinking, and that's me, but you might imagine investors, ones who have seen many, many businesses, might be thinking the same way, which is it all comes down to how much traction you've got. And if you've got revenue that's growing 20% month on month, and you're doing £1 million a year in revenue, you can take the revenue, multiply it by some number to work out the valuation. And you used to be able to, last year or the year before, your valuation was like 10x annual revenue. So if you're doing £1 million a year in revenue, 10 million valuation. These days, that's probably halved, and you might struggle to get 5 million valuation from £1 million revenue, depending on the rate it's growing. It could be more, could be less. But so valuations are a bit down. But of course, you're thinking that, great, Anthony, thanks for that, but I'm nowhere near revenue. Okay, so you don't have revenue. Have you got users? If you don't have users, have you built something? If you haven't built something, have you got a prototype that you can validate? If you are B2B, do you have letters of intent or expressions of interest or signed contracts? So the more validation you have, the more you can raise at a higher valuation. If you're right at the beginning of the journey, there's really nothing to validate it. So it's just you and an idea, and maybe you've spent a few £1,000s on a mock-up and so on. So I think fundraising falls into a range of patterns. And it goes something like this, which is the founders obviously put a few tens of K in themselves to create something. Then you might raise £50,000 from friends and family, maybe at £1 million valuation. And then you may raise £200,000 from angel investors, maybe at a £1.5 to £2 million valuation. And then you may raise £500,000 to £700,000 from angels and early stage funds, maybe at a £3 million valuation. And then you may raise a Series A of a few £1,000,000 at a £10 or £15 million valuation. And you can see each time you're raising about 3 times the last time. Doesn't mean you have to do all of those steps. You can skip some. And each time you're using that money to get to the next step. And the next step is further along the traction level. So it's all about convincing investors that you've got a great long-term story, that there's a vision, that you can deliver on the first part of the vision clearly. So one of the problems that I frequently see founders make is that, you know, everyone knows fundraising is difficult. It takes a long time. It's a deviation from what you'd like to do. Sometimes investors will say, why are you only raising 500? Raise $1 million. It's just the same amount of work. This is generally really stupid advice, and I'll tell you why. So you're thinking, well, it's hard work fundraising. So what I'm going to do, I know I need to raise for like 18 months. So what I'm going to do is, how much do I need to raise? Well, in the next 18 months, I'm going to need like 2 software developers. I'm going to need a marketing person. I'll need a salesperson. I'll need a data person. I need a designer. And there's like 2 founders. So that's 8 people. And let's assume I need to budget £50,000 a year for each of them. So that's £400,000 a year. I need to raise for 18 months. I need £600,000. And if I'm going to dilute by 15%, you basically, you just take the amount that you want to raise, multiply it by 5 to be the valuation. That means the investor will own 1 in 6, 16% afterwards. So you go, great, I'm going to raise £600,000 at a 3 million valuation. Awesome. And then I'm set. So now you go talk to investors, and they see you raising 600K. They ask what the valuation is. My suggestion is put the amount you want to raise in the slide deck with the magic words SEIS and EIS, but don't put a valuation in the slide deck because it might change. And you don't want different versions of the slide deck floating around with different numbers. But anyway, the investor goes, oh, right, great. You're raising 600K at 3 million valuation. That's great. What have you built so far? And you go, oh, this here slide deck is what we built. And they go, love what you're doing. Come back later. So the story of your life as a founder is usually the love what you're doing, come back later. And there are 2 reasons for that. One of them is you trying to raise too much too early at too high a valuation. And number 2, you're talking to the wrong investors. So that's a bit of a passion point for me. So I'll spend a moment on it, which is, I'm sure you're thinking, love all this, Anthony. I just don't know any investors. Where am I going to find them? So, of course, angel investors don't have websites and funds do. So you go off and find, you know, on the SeedLegals site, the top 10 funds or 50 funds or the best funds in Manchester or whatever it might be, and you go and write to them. And if you do manage to get a meeting with them, then it usually goes, which is, great, show me the deck. And at the end of which they go, how much are you looking to raise? What stage you're at? Love what you're doing, come back later. And the problem is funds are a bit more risk averse. They've got an investment committee. So funds will usually only invest at the point you've got revenue or later. And it's rare that they'll come in earlier. So if you go into a fund, certainly before you've built a product and quite possibly before you've got users or revenue, they'll tell you, love what you're doing, come back later. And so your goal is actually go to angel investors. How do you find angel investors? Well, angel investors are everywhere. And the problem is you can't write, well, you can write to everyone. So my tip is create a great pitch deck. Make a nice video, because people love video. No one's got attention span anyway these days. Create a pitch page is my view on SeedLegals, but you can use DocSend, DexSend, whatever. It looks great on SeedLegals. And then make a nice social media post, which is working on new whatever, solving this problem. And James is going to tell you all about that perfect pitch, a lifestyle image of person with an app or whatever is appropriate, raising, £300,000 or whatever, offering SEIS and EIS, contact me for more. And then be completely shameless. Post this on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, wherever you are. Write to your friends, family, customers. Don't make it look spammy. Make it look like this is your new passion and do they want to learn more? And if things go well, some people write to you about investment. Others might write to you going, oh, have you heard of these competitors? So that's good knowledge. Others might go, I don't really understand what you're doing. So you're going to get feedback to help you hone the pitch, because if you can't get the pitch right, you're probably not going to get the product right. And others will go, my father's got a business and could partner and is interested in buying it. So the more noise you make, the more inputs you'll get. So I think, to me, the formula is create something that shows how you're solving a problem, that you're passionate about it, lifestyle image, be completely shameless and spread it, write to your customers as well. And then you're going to raise from angel investors. And you might say your first round is, instead of trying to kiss a lot of frogs until you manage to raise a large round, which means you are funding the business yourself while you're looking for that perfect funding round. It also means you can't hire people because you don't have the money. Instead of doing a big round and waiting to get everyone lined up, can you raise step by step en route? So, and then I'm going to tell you about that in a moment. And in the meantime, I will switch to a couple of questions. And I think I've only got 5 minutes left. So why don't I switch to my last slide?
15, Anthony, if you want. Up to 15.
Okay. All right, cool. Well, I'll talk about agile fundraising, and then I'll switch to Q&A, and then maybe, James, you can even read some of the questions so that I can look at the camera. All right. So I used to joke, or do joke, that in 2018, I would show people how to close a funding round. And in 2019, I would now show you how to not do a funding round. So what does that mean? So a funding round is a bit like, to me, organizing a holiday bus trip. So you have to have all the people who want to go on holiday round up together to meet at a certain time, to get on the bus, to go off together. And the bus can only go when the last straggler arrives. And if anyone is late, it holds up the bus. And it's kind of like a funding round. You've got lots of investors. You need to line them up, agree the deal terms and the valuation. And if and when you get that all lined up, that's great. But it's not the only way of doing it. What if you could raise individually from people ahead of the round? And what if you could top up a round? So raising ahead of the round is with a SeedFast. So SeedFast, we didn't invent it, but we productized it and branded it. It's something known as an advanced subscription agreement, or ASA. We call it a SeedFast. And it's an agreement that says, I will give you money now, and you will give me money when you do your next funding round. And we don't need to agree a valuation now, because in fact, it's probably impossible to. So to incentivize me, my investment will convert into shares when you do your next funding round at a valuation to be determined in the round. But you'll give me a 10 or 20% discount to incentivize me to come in earlier. So SeedFast again is, I give you money now, you'll give me shares when you do your next funding round at a discount. And if you don't do a funding round within 6 months, this is needed for it to be SEIS or EIS compatible, then you'll give me shares anyway at a valuation we agree now, called the long stop valuation. So the advantage of a SeedFast is twofold. Number one, instead of waiting for all the investors to come together to be big enough for a funding round, you might meet someone at an event who goes, hey, love what you're doing, can I invest 10K? Instead of saying, come back in August, you go, yes, let me send you a SeedFast. And the second problem it solves is you only really get to agree a valuation once you've got a sufficient mass of investors together that they're buying into the valuation. But if you've got this one person investing 10K, how do you know what the value is? So could you have an agreement that says, we'll figure out the value between now and later, and you can use that money to build more to increase the valuation. So it's a win-win. The investor gets a foot in the door for your funding round, they get a discount, and for you, you're getting the money earlier, which means you can start hiring people, even maybe paying yourself a salary, or at least not having to pay for everything yourself. And so what's happened over the last couple of years, and particularly the last 2 years, SeedFasts and its opposite, which is a rolling close where you top up a round later, have become insanely popular, which is funding rounds as a whole are down somewhat because of the lower valuations. Investors, at least funds, are often having to support the existing portfolio. They're a bit more risk averse. So funding rounds as a whole are down, but people raising ahead of a round with SeedFast is up. And there's now more money raised on SeedLegals, amazingly, outside of a funding round than in a funding round. So SeedFast are kind of the new norm. And it means that you have a different way of fundraising, which is instead of, I need to line up everyone and agree the deal terms and everything, it's like, I'm going to invert it to everyone I meet is potentially somebody that I can take some money from now and use that to grow the business. And here, I would say that the pattern might be, you're planning to raise, let's say, £300,000. You still are planning to do that, but ahead of the round, if you can get 50K or maybe 100K up front that will convert in the round, that would be about the right pattern, along with £200,000 in the round itself. Some people take it further and they just don't even bother doing a funding round. They just keep raising with SeedFast, and after some months, they all convert and get their shares, but they're almost skipping the round. I wouldn't encourage that as the pattern, but some people do it. And probably the high point of that was the Thursday dating app, where the founders were fundraising machines. I mean, there were pictures of them on standing on the banks of the Thames on embankment with a cardboard cutout saying, now fundraising, send money for dating app or something like that. They did literally 100 SeedFasts. At peak, they were raising one SeedFast per hour, I think. And they raised £2 million and then it converted later on. So it's a different way of doing it. And after your round, once you've raised, you might be thinking, well, I need to do a new funding round, but that's also a pain. What if I could top up my last round? So that's where what we call instant investment, which is when you do a funding round, you build into the funding round the rights to add more investment later at the same or higher valuation, so you can even increase the valuation. So putting the two together, I call it agile fundraising. And I know that fundraising is a complete pain and it's a timeout from doing other things. You don't want to be living hand to mouth by like having 30 days cash in the bank and I need another SeedFast. But if you can think about a strategy that lets you raise some amounts now to get on with building things and then the funding round later. So that was it from me. Before I turn to questions, I hope that was like the set of roller coaster from beginning through to fundraising.
Awesome.
And you can drop me a note, Anthony at seedlegals.com or on LinkedIn. But let's go through a few now. So James, do you want to read the questions?
Yeah, what I'll do is
yeah.
I've just got a few slides I'm going to share. We'll give you
okay. Oh, sorry, go for it. Yes.
Chance to rest your voice, maybe grab some water, and then we'll come back to Q&A at the end, and maybe we'll tackle that together, Anthony. We'll sort of go through it together. So look, thanks so much, Anthony. As I said, loads of knowledge shared there. I saw a lot of you taking lots of. There was a lot of tops of heads I saw as they were sort of scribbling notes. So I'm sure they've got so much out of today's session. So massive thank you, Anthony, once again for being here. So I just want to, before we jump into questions, just leave you today by sharing a few gifts with you all. So you can learn much more about the fundraising process by getting a copy of my book, Investable Entrepreneur. You can go to the Robot Mascot website, click Get the Book in the menu, and from there you'll be able to get a free copy. You get a free PDF, or you can choose a free audiobook, or if you're in the UK, you'll be able to get a free physical copy sent directly to your door, postage paid on us, completely free to you. You don't need to spend a penny. And also find loads of freebies and support for raising investment in our free resources section of the website as well. So head over to the Robot Mascot website, get your free copy of the book and explore all the free resources there. If you haven't already, some of you probably have, but I'd highly recommend you take our Pitch Ready scorecard. This is going to help you benchmark your investment readiness. Again, it's completely free. It takes about 3 minutes to complete. You'll get a free tailored report on your investment readiness with tips and hints on how to improve that score, completely tailored to you based on the inputs there. So that's pitchready.co.uk to go and get a free tailored report on your investment readiness as well. And you can also connect with me on socials. James Church on what is it, LinkedIn and Facebook. I'm at James Church 88 on Twitter and Instagram. Daily insights on those channels around raising investment, as well as fortnightly videos on the Robot Mascot YouTube channel as well. So if you're on YouTube, give us a follow at Robot Mascot too. So for those of you that don't know, what we do day to day at Robot Mascot is support founders like you through what I call the pitch ready journey. We develop business plans, projections, pitch materials. We develop investor outreach campaigns, so founders are presenting a believable business case, credible financial forecast, a compelling pitch, and have investors lining up to get involved. So then you can go and do all of this amazing legal stuff that Anthony's been talking about today. So what happens when you have all four of these elements in place in your arsenal as a founder? You have the plan, the projections, the pitch, the promotion. Is what you're doing is you're signaling to investors that you are an investable entrepreneur, you are investor ready, you can be trusted with their money. And with more competition for capital than ever before, all investors are looking for is to identify a good risk, right? They're treating you like a risk. You're an opportunity, but you're also a risk, and they're just trying to identify a good entrepreneur, a good risk to invest into. So with about 1% of founders successfully closing their deal, you really do have to demonstrate to these founders, to these investors, you're something special. You're this investable entrepreneur. You're the full package, and you really understand how to invest their capital to get the major returns. And the way the investor understands whether or not you make a good investment opportunity, whether or not you're a good risk, is through your kind of business planning, your financial projections, your pitch materials, and all of the things that Anthony's talked about today. Having all of those things in place prior to speaking to them shows that you really are capable of being the founder that they should back. So a Robot Mascot, it's our mission to support founders like you to raise the capital that we've been talking about in this session, the capital you deserve for your vision. So it's our job to position you as an investable entrepreneur. We work with founders to develop yourself as well as these assets. Through the process of developing all of this that I just talked about, you're developing yourself as an entrepreneur. So we've crafted 3 ways of supporting you in doing that. And we find that when we do that with clients, they become more confident in their business case, they perform better in pitches, and they hold their own under investor scrutiny. And as a result, they're 40 times more likely to raise the investment that they're looking for. So as I mentioned, there's 3 different ways that we work with founders. You can go on a Pitch Ready Sprint, which is a 12-week investment readiness program. You can go through some Pitch Ready mentoring, which is one-to-one tailored support through monthly coaching, and you can do a Pitch Ready Seed, which is a complete done for you service where I have a team of experts, ex-investors, business strategists, financial strategists who will create the business plan, the projections, the pitch materials for you, alongside you. Essentially, our team focus on getting you investor ready so you have the time to focus on building your business and getting the traction and the development of the product that you need out there. So with each of these services, you'll get full access to an investor outreach strategy as well, giving you the tools and the tactics you need to quickly meet, seek, and convert investors on your round. So this is the type of example of what can happen when you get this funding strategy right that we've been talking about today. Like Robert and James, our clients at Plend, I think they're also a SeedLegals client. Huge success with our support. We've been involved in both their pre-seed and seed funding round. 700k pre-seed, that was 300k more than they were asking for, and then they went and closed a 40 million seed round from leading VCs quite recently as well. Outmin recently landed a 1.5 million euro seed round, using the exact strategies that we've been talking about today as well. So look, if you want to explore working with us, before we jump into the questions, just type number 1 into the chat now. I'll send you a short eligibility assessment. We can get a deeper understanding of your current situation. We can arrange a one-to-one with a member of our team to talk about all of this in a bit more detail about how we get you investor ready and the sorts of things you need. So just number 1 into the chat and we can sort of start those conversations. So basically, in essence, what we're doing is we're kind of taking founders from this position where perhaps they feel a bit lost in the maze, not going about, not knowing how to go about raising investment for the best, what way to turn, what to do for the best. And we're lifting the lid on that fundraising process. We're giving you this 100-foot view to the path to becoming an investable entrepreneur and closing your round so you have everything you need and you know exactly which way to turn. So over to questions now. That's us. That's Robot Mascot. Thanks again for joining us today, and Anthony for all of your time. Over to questions. There was a really good one to kick things off in the chat. What's a responsible amount or the average amount for a founder to pay when they decide pay themselves their salary when deciding on how much to raise? I think that's always a great question. I've got my opinion. I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
That's a great question. I've seen some heated conversations on LinkedIn about that. So firstly, sometimes as a founder, I mean, you may need the money unless you're independently wealthy, but you may also feel embarrassed that you're paying yourself a salary. So firstly, some investors might be asking, how much are you putting into the business? And you should be quite strong on the response, which is, I've put time into the business. If I could put money, I wouldn't be fundraising. That's why I'm fundraising. Otherwise, I've been getting way less than market salary or no salary for all this time. That is the money, which is much bigger than a pound amount. But in terms of salary to pay yourself, so I think astute investors know that as a founder, you need to pay yourself, because unless you're independently wealthy, otherwise you're going to moonlight and start doing consulting work, and then it's in no one's interest because you're not spending your time on the business. It's less good for the investor and less good for everyone because the business isn't growing. So the idea broadly is perhaps in super early stage, you're raising 200k, you might pay yourself a 30k salary. And then when you're raising 500 or 700k, you might pay yourself 50k or thereabouts. And once your valuation, and once you're raising a few £1 million, then you might start paying yourself 80k or more. So we've got some stats on SeedLegals on founder salaries, but broadly it might go, start from 30k and at your first round up to 100k or more once you're doing £1 million a year in revenue. At SeedLegals, my co-founder and myself are not the best paid people in the company. We have a more modest salary than others. So it's always tempting to go and vote yourself a larger salary. But the point is, if investors see that half of the investment money is going back to you as the founders, that you don't look very investable. So generally sort of 30 to 60k in early stage rounds would be about the
I think that's kind of the range. And I think the important thing is to be able to justify it to the investors, right? So you picked up on a point of kind of, they don't want you moonlighting. They're investing in you because they want you to be able to focus on this full time. So let's say you need to sort of figure out, everyone has their own circumstances in life. Maybe you have a family with 4 kids that you need to support, and maybe you're just out of university and you're flat sharing with with 3 of your mates. Like everyone has different life circumstances. So I think it's about sitting down and going, what's my survival budget? What's the minimum I need to get by for the next 12 to 18 months? Keep a roof above my head, keep my kids in clothes, keep food on the table, but no extravagances. What's my minimum survival? Where can I make some personal cuts? That is how much you pay yourself. And then when investors ask, so that could be 30, that could be 50, that could be 60. But when investors ask, it could be 18, right? When investors ask, you can say, here's the sacrifices I'm making. Here's what I need to do for me to be committed to this full time and not have to go and do some moonlighting, some gigs on the side that are going to distract me from building value for you and getting return, building return on your investment. And as long as you've had that honest conversation with yourself, you can have that honest conversation with investors. So that would be my take on it.
Okay. So let's jump to the question about, it's a SeedFast as a convertible equity. So it's a great question. So many people are familiar with the thing called the convertible note. So convertible note is, I give you money, and if you do a new funding round, then you'll give me shares, just like a SeedFast. But if you don't do a funding round, then you'll repay my investment. And that's very much like the future fund thing that came out. Now, convertible notes have got a few problems, 2 main problems. One of them is, if you don't do a funding round, that usually means you don't have any money. So entering into an agreement that says you'll repay somebody is a formula for going bankrupt if you don't have revenue. So convertible notes are usually used by later stage companies who need capital for some new project, but they have got the revenue stream to repay it. They're usually not appropriate for early stage companies who don't have revenues to repay it if they don't do a funding round. But the second thing is, because a convertible note can be repaid and can earn interest, it doesn't qualify for SEIS or EIS. And since essentially all early stage UK funding rounds are driven by SEIS and EIS, convertible notes in the UK have never been popular. And instead, a SeedFast is kind of like half of a convertible note. It says, I'm going to give you money, and regardless, you're going to give me shares. You don't repay me, and I don't get interest. Instead, I might get a discount on your next round. And that gives much more favorable terms for you, because you don't risk going insolvent by having to repay, and you don't have an interest charge accruing as well. And of course, the investors getting their SEIS tax discounts as part of the sweetener on that. The second part of that question was, what's the SeedFast equivalent after the funding round? And that's what we call instant investment. So really, when you do a funding round is a set of documents, a shareholders agreements and articles that specify how the company is run. It says the obligations of the founders, the rights that the shareholders have, the protections in place, and so on. And everyone signs one of the shareholders agreements, and everyone agrees to the articles. When you add somebody to the funding round later, what you're doing is they're signing what's called a deed of adherence, saying, I didn't sign that originally, but I'm now agreeing to that. And we've codified that and productized that, and we call it instant investment. So we create all the documents, the share certificate and the share issue form and the deed of adherence, so that you can essentially add people to your last round after the round is closed. You're not reopening the round, they're signing some agreement to go, it's as if I had been part of that round, but you can increase the valuation at the time. And together, they make it much easier to fundraise before and after a round.
Cool.
Okay,
so I don't know if we've covered it, but sort of leading on from that, Nico has asked, how would topping up of a round sort of work? How does that?
Right, great question. So the nice thing is, when you've done a funding round, you've agreed with your investors all the deal terms. Do you get a board seat, and what the investor consent rights are, and what the founder vesting is? These are all agreed. So wouldn't it be great if you could find another investor and say, if you're happy with these last round terms, can you give me some money, and I'll give you a document that says you agree to that, and we're done. So topping up a round is really the minimum set of documents that has an investor essentially come on board as if they were part of the last round at the same deal terms. So by the way, when you do a funding round, the investors, part of the consents they usually get is that you can't issue more shares without giving them a preemption right, the right to buy them themselves, and Maybe you have to have their consent, and you have to have a shareholder resolution. These all add friction. So when you do a funding round on SeedLegals and you select that you can top up, we build in all these consents up front, so the investors have up front said you can raise another £300,000 between now and Christmas at the same or higher valuation without asking us again. So it makes it really easy. I mean, you still have the hard work of finding an investor. Once you have an investor, then you don't have to ask permissions. You can just go off and create the document for them, and like that day, sign it up. So, and once people find the habit of doing that, I think from what I've seen, the pattern, it becomes quite transformative. On a rainy Sunday, you meet somebody, or close the investment and so on. So it changes the way you do things.
Yeah, brilliant. And we've got another question coming on about the SeedFast, but I think perhaps probably more broadly around investment. Is there any security you can make with the SeedFast, or I guess any other investment? So if a founder was to start another company, is your investment protected?
Fascinating point. And I think when you find astute investors, they understand the rules of the game, so to speak, which is, I'm giving you money, you giving me shares. The whole thing's risky. I don't have security in your company. I don't have a security over your house. I have some protection. So if you leave the business, you have to give back some of your shares. But ultimately, the biggest risk in your company isn't that you're going to probably abscond. It's just that nobody wants your products, or you're not going to be able to build it. Those are the key risks. So the problem occurs when you've got naive investors, sometimes friends and family who are well-meaning, who go, well, can you guarantee that you'll give me a return on my investment? Can you guarantee to buy my shares back for 3x in a few years' time? Can you give me shares that will never dilute, because I don't want to be diluted? You should never agree to any of these things. They're always a disaster. So there's something called non-diluting shares, where you may have naive but well-meaning people going, I'll invest for 10%, but I wanted to keep staying 10%. Don't do that, because by them staying at 10%, it means all the existing shareholders are essentially buying more shares for them each funding round, so they don't get diluted. Initially, it's going to dilute you, but in your next funding round, your new investors are going to say, why would I want to invest if I'm just going to be buying more shares for others? So it kills your investability. You should never offer investors that you'll buy back their shares for two reasons. One, any buyback arrangement means they won't get SEIS or EIS, it's excluded. And secondly, if you're offering, if they have a right to require the company to buy their shares, the company, if it doesn't have any money, it can't buy their shares. And no new investor is going to give you money they're going to give you money to grow your business, not to give back to some previous investor. So all of these arrangements that have you buy out other investors are really non-starters. And what you want instead is to explain, if you're Barclays Bank, you lend somebody money and you get 8% interest or something like that. The most you'll ever get is 8%. So you want to pick an investment that's highly, reliable. It's got very low risk, otherwise it's not worth it. With a startup investment, you could get 5x or 10x or more return on your investment, 10x, but it doesn't mean that that's reliable. So what you're doing is you're entering into some agreements. You're going to work as hard as you can to make it a success for them and for you. For them, they're going to get their tax discounts and they're going to be along for the ride. Hopefully they'll top up in your next round. If they can help you with advice, referring your business, doing intros, that's awesome. But that is the rules of the game for equity investment. It's the higher risk and dramatically higher return, which is why your 5-year business plan is going to show, but not promise, that the business is going to be worth 10 or 50x or whatever it is in some number of years.
I think it's important to realize that the reason the UK is one of the, in Europe, the leading place for startup investment is because of the SEIS and EIS schemes, which are there to de-risk this high risk. So you don't get securities from the founder or in the shareholders agreements typically. And as Anthony said, you should avoid them at all costs. But instead your investors are getting SCIS and EIS, which is reducing the risk significantly on their capital, while still getting 100% of the benefit from the returns, plus they don't have to pay any tax on it. So even more than any other investor would get. So those help to offset it. But be careful with sort of preference shares. They tend to come into force more with sort of VC funds at Series A plus, but some angels might look to throw them in there as well, and these sorts of things can scupper you as well. I think, Anthony, you've got a great story about some founders who actually owed investors money after they exited their business because of some preference shares or something like that. Is that you've got to be really
the 2-minute thing on the 1-minute thing on preference shares. So what is a preference? So normally everyone in this early stage UK company has ordinary shares. This means if you've got 10% of the shareholding in the company, when the company's sold, you get 10% of the amount the company was sold for. But for investors, they have a worry. So, you two people have gotten together, you've noodled over something, you've now fundraised at a notional valuation of £2 million. So the two founders are now notionally like a millionaire from owning 50% each at your 2 million valuation, but you've got no product, you've really got nothing. So what if you decide to sell the business for £1 million valuation? For you, it's great. You've got £500,000, but the investors just lost half of their money because it's at half the valuation. So what investors will often ask for, funds, is something called a preference share, which says when you sell your business, I get my money back first, and then we can split the rest. And you can't get that for SEIS or EIS. So the good news is those SEIS, EIS investors, it's another one of those big end of town terms that they won't get. There's nothing inherently wrong with giving your investors preference shares. In our last round, we had Index Ventures, and they said, we want preference shares. We didn't even blink an eyelid because you're not going to get investment from them without them getting preference shares. But what you have to be careful about is if you raise large amounts of money with investors getting preference shares and you have a low value exit for the business, if you've raised £10 million with investors getting preference shares and you sell your business for £10 million, the first £10 million goes back to the investors, and as founders, you'll make precisely zero. So it's a slight gamble that you're taking. If you're raising large amounts, and have a low value exit, you personally may not get very much from the deal, but it's going to be one of the trade-offs when you do raise, particularly from VCs, and do raise larger amounts later. That's the high stakes game of poker that you're playing.
Yeah. So this is why you need a team like SeedLegals on board, right, to help you navigate all of these terms that investors might try and throw into the agreement you think are pretty innocent at the time, but have longer term consequences that you need to consider. So you need to make sure you get all that out on the table, and that you
exactly. And my goal is, using our resources and data and team, and importantly, the funding round workflow. We walk through all the things that you want to offer to your investors or that they might want to ask, so that you're always starting from the right way, and you're empowered and you're driving. So you making the offer to investors, not waiting for them to tell you what they want. At some point later on, when you get to VC, they may start dictating the terms more, but by that point, you'll have the history and you'll have the knowledge as well. All right, last question then I see is from Sean. It says, does SeedLegals provide corporate secretary services? Well, you can do your confirmation statement, you can do board meetings, there are a few other things, but we're not really in that business. But if you sign up, it's a free trial, you can explore it, and maybe it does enough of those things, the cap table, the company house filing pieces, that actually didn't really need much more beyond that.
Yeah, brilliant. Awesome. Well, look, thank you, Anthony, for being with us today. We're bang on time, which is perfect. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge. I think everyone got a huge amount of value from today's session with you. So thank you all, everyone. See you all later for an event again soon. And Anthony, thank you very much. We can go.
Thank you, everyone. Look forward to seeing you at some of the London's fantastic startup events. There are lots of them. So have a look around, and you can ping me and I can send you the events newsletter, because walking the walk and talking the talk. When investors talk to you and they see, both a great pitch deck and what you're talking about and you think about it in a certain way, it makes much more investable. So there are lots of great events around. And look forward to meeting in person as well. All right.
So see you there. We'll learn how to quack.
Exactly. All right.
See you all later. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.